The Pew Research Center came out with a very shocking statistic recently, and here's what it is. It's that today, 39% of people in the United States, 39% of adults, feel more anxious today than they did 1 year ago. 39%. Wow. That should shock us. If that was some sort of physical disease that caused bodily harm, like COVID, for example, it'd be the worst epidemic ever. 39% of American adults feel more anxiety today than they did 1 year ago. That's shocking. There's this author, his name is Edward Freeman, and I always forget the title of his book, but he talks about this very reality. He has what he calls the cycle of anxiety. What's present in a culture that creates and fosters and really allows for anxiety to grow at a level that is uncontrollable. The interesting thing, too, is that he points out that ground zero for this type of anxiety, for this cycle to exist, is the United States. So you have the Pew Research Center, and you have this guy who are saying, we are ground zero for anxiety in our world. Yikes. And here's the steps for the cycle of anxiety from Mr. Friedman. He says the first thing that has to be present is this reactivity. And what does he mean by reactivity? This is what he means. When we see something exteriorly that's outside of us that creates this very strong interior disturbance, negative emotional response. So an example of this reactivity. There's no political message from me in this. This is just a great example. Imagine for a moment you see a news article and you see that the title says, global warming is destroying our ocean ecosystem. That's a great example because for some people, they'll see that title, you know what they're going to think? They're going to be angry. Global warming doesn't exist, they might say. For others, they may not be angry, they may be filled with fear. Oh my goodness, we're destroying our Earth, our planet. Either way, those who are angry or those who are afraid, the first thing they're going to do is click on that article because it works. Reactivity. That's what he means by reactivity. We're playing off of people's emotions and getting them and drawing them in that way. The second thing that needs to exist for the cycle of anxiety to self-perpetuate itself is this mob mentality. Easy example, Detroit Lions fans, we're the best example for this. How many of you, like me, you see the very first play, and it's the interception of the game on Friday night, and all these players are playing who don't even matter, but yet somehow there's all these, I follow all these message boards, probably shouldn't, but I do, and oh, we're going to be terrible, see, this is why I shouldn't get my hope up, and this is social media to a T. Negative news is shared, and people just kind of herd together and just rally around this negative stuff. So that's the second thing, this herding mentality about negative things in our world. And the third one is just as obvious. It's that blame shifting is just a normal part of the culture. Where else do we need to look than our politicians? And again, I don't mean any judgment upon them, but how often do we hear, oh, it's not the Democrats' fault, it's the Republicans. Or it's not the Republicans' fault, it's the Democrats. If it exists in our politicians, we best believe it exists in the general population. This tendency to blame shift. It's not my fault, it's yours, and vice versa. What I find fascinating about Mr. Friedman's observations about our culture and why the cycle of anxiety exists is that he says the only way to stop this self-perpetuating cycle of anxiety is by injecting in the very middle of it a non-anxious person. I don't know about you, but that sounds like our gospel this weekend. Here we have this storm at the sea. The apostles are on it, on their boat. They're filled with fear. They're terrified. There's a great anxiety in them. And who comes but the non-anxious person himself, Jesus Christ. He literally walks on water to them. And he not only calms the storm and the sea, but he brings peace and tranquility to the hearts of his followers. The only reason this anxiety ended was because a non-anxious person was put in the middle of it, at the heart of this anxiety. I think the question then for us is, how do we allow Jesus to do that very same thing in our culture? Because if we have this cultural deficiency in our country, where 39% more Americans are more anxious today than they were a year ago, where the cycle of anxiety is ground zero in our country, then doesn't it seem obvious that the non-anxious person that we need to put into the middle of our culture is Jesus Christ? I think so. The answer for us is allowing this non-anxious person, who is the Lord, to come into our lives and to give us the peace we so desire. So what does that look like? Well, three things, three songs to really articulate what this looks like. One of my favorite songs is called It Is Well, especially the version from Bethel Music. It Is Well is great. And there's this point in the song where she sings, "Let go my soul and trust in the Lord, who the wind and waves still obey." So what is she saying? She's saying, first of all, let the Lord come into our lives, who has power and authority to control everything. Well, what do we need to do? Just like the apostles in this gospel, what has Jesus done? He has come into their presence, and what has he said? He says, "It is I. Do not be afraid." This is just like what St. John says in his gospel. All the times that St. John says, "I am the bread of life, I am the gate, I am the shepherd," all those ways in which he says that is to go back to the Old Testament where "I am sent to you" is what God says to Moses. In other words, in St. John's gospel, "I am" means "I am the Lord." In this gospel, in the gospel of Matthew, this moment where Jesus says, "It is I," the Greek is literally, "It is I am." I am, the Lord of all things, is present in your midst. What's even more beautiful is we've heard several times in Matthew's gospel already. Matthew chapter 3, "Behold, this is my beloved Son, with whom I am well pleased." Then we heard last week at the Transfiguration, "Behold, this is my beloved Son, listen to him." And finally this weekend, Jesus says, "It is I, it is the Lord of your life." And what's beautiful is at the very end of it, we hear from the apostles, truly, this is the Son of God. It's the first time we hear them say and them confess together, this is the Lord in our presence. So the first thing for us to do is to allow the Lord to be present in our lives. That's number one. And then the second thing, this is where St. Peter shines. Now, you could say St. Peter also makes a mistake in this gospel. I want to focus because he often opens his mouth, he says the wrong thing, and we kind of pick on St. Peter a lot. So we're going to affirm him this weekend a little bit. There's another song that I love. It's called Control by 10th Avenue North. And the song is all about handing over control of our lives to the Lord, to God, to Jesus Christ. What does Peter do? Once Jesus has announced, "It is I, do not be afraid," Peter looks up and he says, "Lord, if you commanded, tell me to get out of the boat and walk to you." What has Peter done? He has handed over control. Notice a couple of things, that Peter hasn't blamed Jesus for the storm, which I think is very important for us to acknowledge. How many of us, when the storms come into our lives, we very quickly blame God. You caused this storm. I would like to point out that that's the third step for the cycle of anxiety, blame shifting. Lord, you caused this. Peter knows that the Lord did not cause the storm. And in fact, Peter knows that that if he's with the Lord, everything will be okay. When he steps out of the boat, it's not as if he has not received any promise from Jesus that the storm will go away. That does not happen. All he gets is, yes, get out of the boat and come to me. No promise that the storm will be taken away. He hands over control. And that's what the Lord wants us to do, to hand over control to him, to let him be the Lord of our lives. The final song, it's one we'll sing today, Oceans. I think many of us love this song. And I like it because it's really this invitation. It's from Jesus to call us out of the boat and to follow him. And I think what's important about this song and really the action and what Jesus wants us to do with this gospel is to allow Jesus to be the non-anxious person in our lives so that he can take care of our own anxiety. But he also wants us to be a non-anxious person in our world. He's sending us out of the boat, right? In this gospel, the boat represents the church and the sea represents the world. Jesus is calling us out of the boat into the world to be a non-anxious presence. That's what he desires for us. A good example of this is, we've been rebuilding our altar servers over the past year, which is great. We've had the great privilege of having, the deacon intern Lawrence, and then we've also had, thankfully he's here, Eldon. Eldon is awesome. But why do people like this help for our altar servers? Because without them, at times the service can be a little bit more nervous, a little more anxious. But what changes when someone is there that they know and trust will get it done and will help them to not forget? It's the non-anxious person that puts them at ease. Jesus is inviting us to be a non-anxious person, to put our brothers and sisters at ease. So my friends, this weekend as we meditate on this beautiful gospel that I think really hits the core of our own human existence in our country, may we allow the non-anxious person, Jesus Christ, to take care of our own anxiety and be inspired to go out and bring peace and tranquility along with Jesus that he desires to give us today.